Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for being here on this very cold day. Appreciate it. I want to offer this talk out to Leslie, Eric, and Kirsten. The philosopher Plato's parable of the cave is the foundation of Western philosophy, according to some. It offers insight into ignorance and transcendence. It warns us of the hostility often shown to those people who think differently. It led to decades of wonderful conversations with my high school students, and it'll always remind me of a wonderful person with a message that I think we need now more than ever. For those of you unfamiliar with the parable of the cave, let's see a hands. How many of you are unfamiliar with the parable of the cave? A couple of people. Okay, good. Here's a very brief and slightly adapted version of that parable. It comes from Book 7 of Plato's Republic. The curtain opens to the interior of a cave, and there, chained up in a line, are prisoners who have been chained for their entire lives. They are only able to see the cave wall. In the cave is a fire. Between that fire and the prisoners are people moving about carrying large objects who, like puppeteers, cast shadows on the cave of the wall. Since the prisoners can only see the cave of the wall, the shadows comprise all of their reality. They don't know that the shadows are just illusions. Like most of us, the prisoners simply accept this flickering reality. After all, the sounds that are echoing off the cave wall seem like they emanate from the shadows. And the prisoner's limited experience is their total truth. So they're trapped within their subjectivity. Then, Plato explains, one of the prisoners, freed from his chains, turns around and the blazing fire overwhelms him, and he's blinded for a moment. Once his eyes adapt, he realizes that he and the other prisoners had been ignorant before. He thinks that now he sees what is real: the cave, the fire, the people walking around. He pities those who are still chained in the cave, both in their body and belief. And he greets those in the cave who are not chained, pleased that now he sees the big picture. However, the free prisoner is then forced up an incline towards some dim light. And when he is thrust out of the cave into the surface, he is once blinded again, but this time by the sun. And in the brightness, he stumbles around idiotically, not sure what's going on. When his eyes finally do adapt to the new world around him, he says, "This is amazing." And he thinks, wait till the others in the cave find out about this. So he goes back into the cave, and in the darkness, that's now what blinds him. And the unbound people in the cave laugh at his bumbling manner as he's trying to figure out how to see again. He says there's a whole nother world on the surface with a fire in the sky that burns 10,000 times greater than this fire in the cave. They think he's mad and maybe dangerous. Better to get rid of this strange person with unusual beliefs. And he yells out in pain as they kill him. Those still in the chains wonder about the scream coming from the cave wall. Close curtain. Now, 2 decades ago, I got the crazy idea to turn this parable into a film. I thought this metaphorical, metaphysical expression of philosophy would be good on film. Now, I had been teaching philosophy, but my love of film went back to 8th grade when my parents got me a little 8mm camera. They did so in the hopes that it would help me with my reading, because books at that time bored me. I watched a lot of TV. Now, I was sent to a reading specialist who misdiagnosed me. He concluded that I had a weak imagination, and I struggled to envision what a book said. I could not see it in pictures. So he thought that if I made films, I would be better able to have the books come alive for me. Now, most of you who know me understand that my imagination was probably never the problem. It was always vivid and probably overactive. And I love picturing things in my mind. And that's why I've always been drawn to moving pictures. I used a lot of videos when I taught high school philosophy. Always on the lookout for new content, I stumbled onto television that made me think. There on the TV were 4 philosophers engaging in conversation aimed not at academics, but at the public and at me. Public television. Make sure you contribute. The show was called No Dogs or Philosophers Allowed. It was fun, engaging, and live with actual calls from viewers coming into the show. This host was a friendly, bearded man with thick glasses wearing mechanics overalls, and the name lapel spelt out philosopher. There was a modern-day Socrates, and his name was Ken Knisley. In a 2005 NPR story, the host, Robert Siegel, shared his admiration for Ken, a Georgetown University philosophy student who drove a cab and taught in high school. Ken's low-tech TV production cast Western philosophy in a casual, informal, and down-to-earth light. As Siegel put it, Socrates, welcome to Wayne's World. As indicated by the show's title, philosophers are pretty low on the social hierarchy in our country, but Ken's thoughtful Socratic style, honed from chatting with his passengers in his taxi, had garnered a small but very loyal following. A month after watching that first episode, I had lunch with Ken. And soon I was part of his small group of wacky creatives. And after being a guest on one show, I slid into the role of being a producer. Unpaid, of course. Ken operated on a shoestring budget. After my first season, I floated this idea. I said, how about if we turn a series of film vignettes about great philosophical issues into an educational tool? We'd pretend to take a cab to various locations, each appropriate for a particular philosophical metaphor. And I said the first one would be to a cave. Ken was all in. So that July, he and I drove down 7 hours to Saltpeter Cave in the town nearby the town of Big Stone Gap, Virginia. It was just by the Kentucky border, and it seemed perfect when we found the cave. Here was a big opening with a little stream trickling through it, and just inside was a great big opening that would be perfect for filming. Easy in, easy out. And free, thanks to our park service. We had our location. The first box, check. So back in DC, we tackled lighting. Because if you know anything about film, there are 4 things about film you have to know. Sound, lighting, and lighting. So, filming by flashlight did not seem like a good idea. And so we wondered, are there any people who are experts in subterranean cinema? We were surprised when we found Dave, a cave videographer, who was a member of the National Speleological Society. Now, Dave took his membership in that organization very seriously because the group pledged to, quote, preserve our irreplaceable underground environments. So we said we would be just like big-time Hollywood producers who said that no animals were harmed in making of this film. We would pledge to protect the cave habitat. So Dave signed on to this project. Main videographer, check. Dave soon lined up Jim, who was a subterranean lighting designer. Did you know there were such things? Anyway, check. Ken and I then dove into the script. Now, he would portray the prisoner, chained up, who is dragged out of his ignorance up into the light of wisdom. He would then morph into another character, a caver who would then descend back through the cave, explaining, deconstructing, and cracking jokes about this metaphorical foundation of Western philosophy. Ken's dual personas would underscore the dynamic interplay of illusion and reality. We threw in some odd scenes and monologues about other philosophical questions. And then we recruited not one, not two, but 3 college professors who were mildly amused at our attempt here, and they were willing to risk their reputation by vouching for us. So after incorporating their revisions, we then went into the props and special effects work. So 2 large burlap bags, roughly stitched, cut, soiled with mud, would become the prisoner's garb. I splurged on some metal link chains from a Hollywood prop supply store, and we had our costume, check. Then our special effects supervisor, me, had to figure out how to make a fire without fire. Because as you can imagine, smoke would damage the habitat of a cave and it would piss off some bats. So we decided we couldn't do that. So I made multiple rows of cardboard flames cut out that would then go back and forth like teeth, and spotlights covered with red, orange, and yellow lighting gel. Created that mirage, check. 1 month later, our lighting designer Jim called to report that he had recruited an entire crew. I didn't realize this, but to light a cave properly, you need a small village to do this, because the battery packs alone for the 6 different lights that you needed to place at different angles to get good lighting meant you had to have a lot of people. Other crew members would carry the second camera, as well as the sound booms, and then prop boxes. Check, check, check. Soon, one fateful weekend, Ken and I rendezvoused with Dave, Jim, Bryson, Doug, Randy, Anya, George, Carolyn, Adrian, Larry, Clayton, and Hank in the woods out in southwestern Virginia. But when we arrived at the cave, our jaws dropped. Because you see, our early October production date had followed an extremely rainy September. What was in July a trickling stream was now a 4-foot deep creek going across the entire cave mouth. Just getting into the cave would mean we'd have to carry thousands of dollars of equipment over our heads, and we didn't know what was on the inside of the cave. So my stomach began to tighten. Ken and I scrambled. We located a second opening to the cave system about 200 yards away, and with the crew getting their equipment ready, Ken, Dave, and I did some quick reconnaissance, and we sketched out a map of the various caverns in the cave, which went much further than the first cave, by the way, and we were ready to film. And then we gathered the crew to sort of have our beginning explanation of the plan for this 2-day shoot. I spoke in my best director's voice. I said, I know some of you can't stay overnight, but for planning purposes, can you please tell me how many of you cannot stay tomorrow? For tomorrow. 11 out of the 12 hands went up. So this would now be a 1-day shoot. My heart raced. The ever optimistic Ken reassured me. He said, you got this. Right. Ken and I reworked the production schedule, and we'd shoot the scenes at the mouth of the cave first while there was still daylight, and then both as the caver and as the prisoner, and then he'd be the caver and he'd go back down way into the cave to where we would have the fire, and then he'd change into his prisoner garb and he'd march back up, and hopefully we'd film the second half of the film first, but we'd be done, I don't know, we were thinking maybe by dinner. That was the plan. Now, it was already 11 a.m. by this time. I'm not going to go into details about the shoot, but I'll say that Ken was his typical wonderful self. He peppered his scripted lines with humorous ad-libs, and most scenes only required two takes, which is very good. We navigated some twists and turns along the way. So, one was, remember our pledge not to damage the cave, right? Well, that included not using the cave as a public toilet. The bladder control of our crew was absolutely amazing. When occasionally someone had to make the 10-minute walk to the mouth of the cave to relieve themselves, others filled in their place. I will say, Ken and I, running on overdrive, turned off our bladder, and we continued for the entire time. Now, the snack supply was very modest, and it was depleted by mid-afternoon. We were not even halfway done, because we were expecting to have a fun-filled dinner at a local restaurant with the crew that evening, so we didn't have any other food. We kept on. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Then we gathered the crew for a pep talk and a question. I said, we have 3 more scenes to shoot. Can we do this? They gave enthusiastic thumbs up and nods. I didn't tell them it was the hardest scenes, but nevertheless. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. At 1:30 a.m., we were in the parking lot for some very thankful goodbyes. Everybody was exhausted, but they were exhilarated. Ken and I were smiling and giddy, and we collapsed at a local motel. Now, so that I don't keep you here till midnight, I'm not going to go through the agonizing process of post-production. Those words for anybody creating a film for the first time should bring you horror. Because getting the raw footage to a final product was arduous. I don't know who was more patient, our underpaid and overworked editor Mustafa or me. Ken was his usual good-natured self, but Mustafa and I tested each other. He usually ignored my editorial comments that were either objectively impractical or beyond his ability, and I just gritted my teeth. Now, 2 months later, we screened our rough cut. It was better than the films I made as a teenager. But, as it turns out, it was well below the standards of much of our audience at the American Philosophical Association's annual gathering at a hotel in Washington, D.C. So, at our grand premiere, we explained to our audience the purpose of our project, which was to create a fun video that would help high school students talk about philosophy. We said we'd watch the film and then we'd discuss it afterwards and talk about high school philosophy. Now, the Committee on Pre-College Instruction of the American Philosophical Association had vetted and approved this workshop, so I sort of felt, I think we'll go okay. Few experiences in my lifetime were as painful as the next 90 minutes. Some in our audience appreciated our well-intended efforts, but others were brutal. One guy, particularly, couldn't even wait for the 20-minute film to be over. He came up to me, baring his teeth. I swear to goodness. He said, "Can we please turn this off?" He was furious. I was awkward and embarrassed, and I just waved him away till the film was over. When it ended, I was ready for critiques of the technical quality. I had hoped that it was good enough to help in the classroom for high school students, but all aspects of this work were attacked. Often the criticisms were contradictory, right? For example, in one case, somebody said it was sophomorically oversimplified, and somebody else said it was too complex for high school. Can't win. But the most common criticism was basically some form of, how dare you disrespect the great Plato with your irreverent humor. Now, Ken seemed less affected than I was by these stuffy academics. For years, he had been poking and prodding them anyway. At the 1989 American Philosophical Association meeting, he attended wearing robe and sandals. He wandered around the convention space holding out a lantern, playing the philosopher Diogenes. Now, one professor asked whether he was, like Diogenes, looking in vain for an honest man. And Ken answered, "No, just for a philosophy professor not concerned about tenure." Ken had gotten used to their sneers, but I was traumatized. So, licking my wounds in the hotel bar over a beer or two, I was struck by Ken's equanimity and good humor. He rose above the narrow-minded old men in tweed jackets and laughed it off. It helped him, I think, in many ways in life. And we like to imagine that we were just like Plato's escaped prisoner, right? Mistreated for seeing the world differently. This narrative of martyrdom and another beer helped ease the pain. Now, it really wasn't that bad of a film, and in 2 weeks I'll bring it up here and we can have a little gathering and watch it. Because after we gave it to 12 high school philosophy teachers, we got back some very positive reviews. But personally, the trauma of that day really settled deep inside of me. In fact, so deep that decades later to today, I have yet to show the final product to my wife and kids. I'm working on it. There's another reason why I haven't shared it, and I'll save that for my conclusion. Now, here's where we get to the philosophy lesson. So I apologize if you don't like philosophy. But I think that the parable of the cave and the film we made to simulate it taught some important lessons that we need today. To start, the film addressed Western's philosophy's dominant metaphysical divide. Our culture is steeped in this belief that there are two very different realms: the immaterial, eternal, perfect, and pure world, and a temporary, flawed, and impure world. And this metaphysical dualism contributed to the condemnation of the body and our entire animal nature. It really became a big part of Western religious approaches to the flesh. And it led to people being burnt to death by ruthless inquisitors who promised spiritual salvation as a way to solidify their secular power. Right? There's an ugly history of that intolerance. And that division can be used in that way. A second lesson is that I think the parable in the film taught pretty well the depths of human ignorance. Okay. So often in life, we think the shadows of illusion are real. We overestimate the reliability of our sources of information, though usually people say this as a joke. You hear often that if it's on TV, it must be true. And people really do think this way often. Lately, we've become more aware of how we can manipulate words and images in AI to create fictional people or events or words, like when Joe Biden's computer-generated voice was a fake robocall to the voters recently up in New Hampshire. Just being aware that it's out there, though, is not stopping voter manipulation, as an example, because the problem's deeper. People are doubting fake news, and lie after lie after lie have chained millions of people in caves of illusion. A third lesson about the film and the parable is that it takes a lot of effort to break out of your ignorance, to get out of those chains. We have to choose to break away from what we're used to, shift our perspective, and examine things with our own minds. Learning is a strenuous personal journey, and it's hard to turn away from the flickering images because we love to binge on them. Fourth, I think the film teaches the dangers of intolerance and the abuse heaped on people marginalized for having radically different perspectives. Some are killed for thinking differently. Socrates was sentenced to drink hemlock for challenging conventional wisdom. And this so traumatized his student Plato that Plato often avoided spelling out his views straightforwardly. So instead, he often hid them within drama, because he could always say, well, that's what the characters are saying, I don't believe that. Or he hid it inside of a metaphor, because he could say, oh, no, that's not what the metaphor means, or, oh, the metaphor, it gave him deniability to do that. In the cave allegory, metaphysics is wrapped up in image and art. And that's one reason why artists are sometimes the best social activists, because they can hide their message in art, which spreads far and wide. We can learn from the cave how visionaries who try to share lessons of transcendent love really threaten those who are interested only in power and profit. Quite often people refer to the cave in describing their understanding of Christ, for example, crucified for challenging secular powers. Christ, King, Gandhi would have been okay had they not challenged those secular powers, but they did, so they were ostracized, jailed, and killed. Now, I'm not so courageous, but I do think it's important to listen to people with novel perspectives. The challenge, though, is which visionaries to listen to, right? Because there are a lot out there selling what they want you to buy. What kind of transcendence should we seek? Now, as a humanist, the visionaries I pay most attention to are those who emphasize human beings and human relationships. The transcendence that I speak is interpersonal. That day at the cave offered me such transcendence, and it helped me learn and accept the lesson of humility that I got that day as well. The allegory of the cave and our attempts to portray it helped me accept that disappointment about our first road trip through philosophy. We had planned a whole series of these. It offered me a framework to understand and accept that I should have known that given our limited resources and my experience, the final product would fall well short of what we had imagined. Ken was a great philosopher and a great actor. I think that my script and the concept was solid, but as a producer, I had a lot to learn. What could I have expected from a one-day shoot? I was playing so many roles, I'm surprised that day I didn't just spontaneously combust. I mean, I was producer, writer, director, prop designer, special effects supervisor, team psychologist, caterer, and a pretty bad caterer at that. But the humility of that unfulfilled dream teaches a useful lesson. It teaches, for one, it's better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all. Because what I had imagined in my head I was going to produce was fantastic. If you could have seen it, you would have agreed. My imagination was strong despite what my reading therapist told me. I hoped that with insightful imagery, humorous twists, and clear explanations, we'd create an award winner. But in the end, what I valued most was the creative human relationships and process that we were engaged in. It offered me a type of transcendence. I have no theistic bones in my body, so I doubt I'm ever going to experience transcendence through some revelation or miracle. My transcendence is down to earth and human. The relationships and the camaraderie that infused that very long day shines still like the sun for me, even at 1:30 a.m. in a parking lot. Our production crew of mostly complete strangers went well above and beyond what their unpaid duties required. It was not simply that they were both willing and strong to do this, to put up with two amateurs stumbling through 14 hours without a porta potty or food, that amazed me. It's that they did it with smiles and enthusiasm. When we were saying goodbye in that parking lot on that early morning, it was like we were a sports team having just won a championship. I mean, people were laughing and hugging, and I had tears of joy in my eyes. And to this day, I'm uplifted by the inspiring generosity of strangers. In the end, I was disappointed about not getting what was in my mind's eye up onto the screen. It was even harder, though, that we never got to know another and better second road trip through philosophy. The last time I spoke to Ken was over the phone. I called his hospital room after he'd come out of surgery for kidney cancer. About a month earlier, he had told me the bad news, and typical of Ken, with his trademark optimism and humor, he made it a pleasant, though poignant, conversation. The odds were against him. He said something about the survival rate for his stage and type of cancer being about 25%. But that was way too low, he assured me, citing his robust health and positive thinking. But the very swift scheduling of the series of operations made me suspicious. I thought that things were worse off than he were making out. In our last phone conversation, Ken was searching for light in the darkness. And he found some. He said he was reveling in the sympathy and attention his situation garnered. He joked, actually, about calling up some old girlfriends to share the news. He said, they'll feel terrible. I had called to cheer him up, but he was raising my spirits. And that's who Ken was. Now, I'm sure that Ken's generous spirit and the ripples of his work are still uplifting people. That's one of the things Ken liked about television, is that once you created a show, it can be broadcast over and over. Beamed through satellites, he might still be with us through the electrical waves that are pulsing through space. Though I haven't watched The Cave, in part because I so miss him, I feel him here. Though never in major distribution, the 100 and plus episodes of No Dogs or Philosophers Allowed was one of the most honored local access cable ace programs in the US. It won 8 first-place awards at the Hometown USA Festival. It was shown in over 250 universities, 27 countries, including Malta, Taiwan, and New Zealand, and it reached 10 million US homes. But most important to me was the fact that Ken was simply one of the nicest people I'd ever known. He was kind and supportive and humble, but he had grand dreams about the role of philosophy in our world. So I want to conclude with some words that I think we need to hear today more than ever. Ken was convinced that our country could be saved by television that makes you think. The combination of electronic image, civic mindedness, and cooperative dialogue could help bring the best out of democracy. As one of his friends, George Lerman, put it, Ken believed that clear thinking can expand the scope of human freedom, and he was passionate about the idea that rational public discussion of complex problems is essential in a democratic society. So today, as democracy is being tested by bullies and braggarts, this message is as important as ever. As Ken explained on NPR, we've talked about democracy. I'm very interested in the whole natural rights philosophy that the Declaration of Independence came out of, because most people don't buy it. And yet, here we have a big, huge continental nation, which in some way is still based on these ideas. Ken continued, well, if we don't buy that, what happens to this insistence upon rights? The insistence upon the equality of human beings? If you can't justify the equality of human beings, where are you left? I don't know. I think that's a good question, end quote. That's a question we're going to have to answer without Ken, and I'm going to miss discussing philosophy with him over a beer or through a film that is better in my head than actually in reality. But he taught me that in the process of sharing and creating together in dialogue and community, a very human type of transcendence is possible, and that is of human connection. So thank you to Ken, to his wife Leslie, to his children Eric and Kirsten. I say what I think you already know. Ken was an amazing person. Thanks for listening.